Hi, Mike Parks and Derek Linden again from Momentum Results, and welcome to our second video on leading teams through the coronavirus crisis. In our first video, we shared with you the insights, views and practical experiences of a number of leaders around the challenges they're facing, as well as the challenges their business was facing and the sectors, as well as their suggestions and ideas of what they're practically doing to address these. We also talked about how they saw team members in sort of three categories: those that are working full on in one or more locations, those that are working full on remotely, the second category, those that are working remotely but not full time, and the third category, those that have been furloughed. And in that video, we gave their initial thoughts on what the things they've been doing to lead the way forward. This second video focuses on getting the teams on board and once they're up and running and how they're sustaining it. And it shares their views, ideas and practices that have been working for them. From the conversations we've been having, there seems to be four sort of key areas that have emerged. One, which we talked about last time round, was about leadership style. The second is very much about direction and the communication of that. The third area is around the new rhythm and routines that they're working to. And the fourth area is the remote working itself, and particularly those virtual interactions. And we're going to look at each of those four areas and share the practical tips, ideas and techniques that leaders have been using. So starting with our first area, which we did talk about last time around, leadership style, and it's just probably worth reiterating some of the key themes that came through that. What transpired was like never before have leaders got to really think about and really be concerned, care, be patient and empathetic with their team members to really understand the challenges they're facing, the worries and concerns. As we emphasised then, it's not about managing people to get things done. It's about managing people's concerns and worries, and they'll make things happen. It's very much about putting people at the heart of everything that happens.
So some of that was around about getting into their mindset as well, and particularly as a leader, the things that worked before might not necessarily work in this new environment they find themselves in, and so they had to be very agile, because it was clearly about understanding people and where they were coming from, and for the leader to flex as well around about the needs of that individual. So that, it's been said before that we need to be agile, but it was very evident from what they were saying that on these occasions they had to bend and bow because of the pressures that people were under, and to figure out what was the best solution for those folks so that they could all be in it together and get the result based on what it was that they were trying to do.
And I think that the thing you touched on there was also that their mindset, really getting into their heads about how they saw the world and how they saw the challenges, and through that being able to move people on and help them. Our second area is around direction and communication, which I know that you've been looking at quite thoroughly, Derek.
Yeah, so there was a fair bit in here that people were kind of unsure at times, and what the leaders were saying was that they had to make sure that they understood where they were heading, that what was the purpose of it all. And when they knew where it was that they were heading because of that purpose, it gave them direction, and it gave them something to focus on, which allowed them then to make decisions around about it. So they also recognised that because that had changed, people might have had different ideas about it. So they made it clear to them what it was that had changed, how that would impact upon them, and therefore how they would have to refocus. So what they talked about was giving them a fairly detailed map of what had occurred and what the future was going to be looking like. And along with painting that picture for them, they recognised that they also had to give them timelines around about it, so that folk could look at them and figure out where they would fit in. And folk then began to make decisions for themselves around about it, which freed up the leader as well, so that the leader could begin to strategize, get these pieces of information that were coming through the business back into those that had to make some decisions at other different levels. So they also recognised that they had to deliver to the organisation in different ways depending on who it was they were talking to. So for the three groups that you mentioned before, Mike, they were talking about what should be the common pieces of information that these folks should be receiving, whether they are full on in the business face to face, or whether they are full on remotely, or whether they are working remotely and not as intense, or whether they are furloughed. All of these folks still had to receive information, and they talked about the sort of information that they should make sure they get out to them, so that each of these individuals could get a handle on how they were going to interact within that information. So it was things like the chief exec's messages, things like business updates, talking about how the company was responding to the different pieces of information that were coming from through governance, etc. They also talked about where some of them, if they were upskilling or whatever else, where training opportunities would arise. And then there were themes that were drifting through in all of the communications that they were having, and there were questions that were coming up. So what they said they had to end up doing was deal with these frequently asked questions and answer them and get that information out to everyone, so that folk then, along with the direction, had more information so that they could get an understanding of how they fitted into everything. They looked as well at the remote workers, and they wanted to make sure that those folk knew where things were going and the timelines around about it, because some of those folk might have been working at a less intense pace, and then suddenly it was going to be ramped up. So they realised that what they had to do with them was give them an understanding of what the timelines were, so that they could make decisions about how they were going to step into that. And they talked to them about how work had changed, and then they started talking to them about what their involvement would be with that and how they could contribute in more ways. They then looked at the furloughed people as well, and they were trying to figure out best ways of contacting them. And what they realised on some occasions was that the contact information was out of date. So they had to re-establish that sort of information. And then, as you'd mentioned earlier on, as people that they're dealing with, and they couldn't just blanket speak to these folk. So they started talking to them individually and figuring out what's the best time to actually have contact with them, because they realised that their priorities had shifted and that they were doing other things. And so once they discovered what the best times were to contact them, they then established what the frequency of that should be, and basically just kind of opened up channels of communication with them. So they tried to figure out different areas that they could get them to get updated on the business were, and it would be things like putting together newsletters which were specific either to the function or to the region that they worked in. They looked at group Zooms for them so that they could just embrace that communication necessity, conference calls, one-to-ones, emails, etc., and perhaps even company announcements and giving them links to that. So what they did realise was that they had to be fairly open with these people about it not being personal as to why they were furloughed, but it was a business decision. It was necessary for the greater good of the business. And they talked to them about why the decisions were made, so that those folk had a greater understanding of it being a group decision. They also talked about others within the organisation reaching out to them so that they kind of weren't left in the dark. So the folk that were in the organisations working quite intensely could reach out because they had relationships with them, and that would build those relationships back up again. And they talked also about having virtual teams. There might have been some quizzes and things happening within the organisation for folk that were heavily involved in it. So it was integrating those folk who were furloughed into situations like that, communication channels, virtual team conversations, so that they weren't just left in the dark. So the sense from that was that they were treating them like people. The sense was that they knew that they had to talk to everyone within the organisation. It was just about positioning that communication so that it did suit the individuals depending on where they were in the organisation, whether they were full on, whether they were remote full on, or whether they were remote less intense, or whether they were furloughed. So that was the kind of gist of it. They looked at all the different areas to get everyone involved in this.
Touched on loads of points now. I mean, as we talked about in the first video, the big watch out is the furloughed and forgotten, and what you described is ensuring that those that are furloughed are not forgotten. And as we spoke in the first video around, it's about getting them match fit, match ready. I know that one leader had talked about it's getting a match fit, match ready for the next 3 months, 6 months when they come back. We're already seeing people come back already, you know, and they're coming on board. I think one of the things that you did touch on is about them understanding why them, and it's not a personal thing about them. It was about their roles and the need for their roles at the current time, and them understanding that. I think lots of the things you talk about, lots of practical things of what's happening. I think the other thing that one organisation shared with me is how they've seen the increase in digital learning. Some people have seen this as an opportunity to really upskill, to gain new knowledge, to acquire new skills, to get qualifications in some of the areas that they've been working in. So they've seen a massive uptake in digital learning. And the other thing another business said to us was that a lot of staff had to be furloughed, but rather than just leaving them, and they cannot work for the organisation. They were aware of lots of connections that they'd got with lots of businesses that were actually looking to increase staff numbers, lots of the retailers, and actually there's an interface to help them temporarily get roles with those retailers. So there's a number of things going on here about direction and communication and getting people on board. I think that leads us then into what are the rhythms and routines that sort of set out in how people are working together. And the starting point that leaders have told us about is having conversations, not surprisingly, about how do we do work, laying out what's fixed, what's not up for grabs, but discussing with individuals and teams about how we work together, what are our new rules, because this whole process has brought new rules and ground rules around how we operate. The whole thing around social distancing is people are becoming innately aware now of their space, their barriers, about, you know, you can't help but I catch things on TV that have been made a while ago and you think, oh, they're standing too close. Your whole mindset is moving on, and that's got to be intrinsically part of it. So agreeing with the teams they've talked about is about how do we do things practically. There's also a lot about not just the sort of the physical social distancing, but also about how that transpires into some of our sort of day-to-day working practices. What are some of the things we're going to do now? What we have seen is a lot of flushing out of stagnant working ways. People have started questioning, challenging the way we've done it. We spoke in the first video about things that normally would take a year to happen have been happening in 6 weeks because people have been stripping out the hurdles. They've been questioning what happens. We've also seen in the last few months that a lot of the mass production of spreadsheets through data and that have started to be stripped out. Things that are produced because they've always been produced have been questioned. People are only producing things that they really need. There's also been a big focus on sort of speed over perfection. That's not about cutting corners. That's not about doing things in ways that risk people's health and well-being, but actually thinking it doesn't have to be the perfect answer. Does it work? Can it happen? And that whole process about does it work is another theme that people have talked to us about in terms of ways of working. There may be barriers and hurdles to doing certain things, but the question is, how can we make it work? What people have been saying, despite that, what are the things we can do? Not what we can't do, but what can we do? And that real focus on, can we make things happen? And there's been a very much a pulling together to say, and it has created a lot more collaboration across businesses. Even though we're seeing more silo working, actually people are trying to do it in a more collaborative way. And the final thing that I picked up around the rhythm and routines is very much around there's a lot being learned at the moment. This is so radical, so different, that people are learning a lot. And there's a big danger that people are learning and moving on, and that learning isn't embedded. People aren't capturing it and actually using it and applying it for going forward. We have a challenge, we find a way forward, and we move on. There's a real focus on trying to capture what we've learned from that, because this is all fresh challenges. This is all new thinking, new ways of operating. So the rhythm and routines are not back to the old days. They're new ways of operating, but learning from them. What are the things that you've sort of, people have said to you, Derek, around this?
Just that stuff that you're describing there, Mike, there's also, for a lot of folk, it's that judgment that they find themselves having to make. So in the past, they might have cut a corner, and they might not have done something that it turned out was an absolute necessity. And it maybe caused people some problems, but they worked around it. Whereas now, some decisions that they make may cause major problems. So, for instance, one of the groups that we were talking to talked about having to clean an area before they leave it, so that the next team that comes in and works in that area has got an environment that is safe to work in. Now, in the past, they might just have run out of time and not cleaned their area, whereas now they absolutely must work on it so that it's ready for the next team coming in. So you can't cut a corner in that. There are other areas where you can perhaps find new ways of doing something, but when it comes to those things that are, as you described it, not up for grabs, it absolutely has to be done. And there's another piece as well about being patient. So one of the groups that we spoke to talked about, because of social distancing, you couldn't have the full team present on a piece of work. So it was only going to be half the team. So there's a piece then about talking to the consumer and saying, this will take twice as long for us to complete this piece, because social distancing dictates that we can't have everyone doing it. Now, the concept was, if it didn't get cleaned, the job was going to have to be left for 72 hours. So the team that were on it had to clean it for the second team to come in and work on it. So there's an example of being patient and changing their working methods to suit the environment that they find themselves in. The past doesn't matter anymore. They've found this new way of working and it absolutely has to be done. But it's also collaborating with the consumer and building their expectation around about it. And that's how they described it. They weren't just in it on their own. They had to go to the consumer and say, please understand where we find ourselves now, and I'm sure you'll understand it. And they did. That was what they pointed out. Everyone was accepted of it. And in particular the staff that they were talking about and the teams that they were talking to, they recognised their part in it. And it's that whole piece about being agile, but making sure the communication's right so that everyone gets it.
I mean, that the point you raised in the middle of all that was around the whole cleansing thing and the sanitising. It raises a massive question mark for offices going forward. I mean, I think those people think that suddenly there's a whistle blown and we're all okay and we're all back to normal. I feel that that's probably not. The office structures are going to be very different going forward. I think the whole thing about the remote working may become more of a norm, the new norm, because of the things that you've described.
Yeah, and that piece as well, Mike, about changing the way that they work instead of it. You know, we mentioned it in the first video. You don't have to necessarily be present physically. It's, you know, you don't have to jump on that flight. There's other ways of working.
No, I mean that whole thing about the travel. I think a lot of people have really started to question. You know, why is it really necessary? Do I need to be present?
Yeah.
You spoke in the first video about presentism, and is there a real need to be there? And we've had examples of people visiting businesses and people there showing, you know, images through phones and video recordings and visits and the like. So I think people are going to be a lot more discerning about that travel. I mean, businesses have for a long time tried to get people to do that because of the cost process, but I think this is really going to stick now because people are thinking of health, welfare, and well-being around it.
Yeah.
I mean, this part of the conversation really leads us into that sort of final area, which is that whole process of working remotely and those virtual interactions. In fairness, you know, virtual working or working remotely has been around for a long time. I think I started working remotely. I wouldn't say it was virtual because there was no facilities, but I started working remotely in 1989. At that stage, there was no mobiles, no laptop, no World Wide Web. I think it was introduced that year. So it was very much working remotely and in isolation. But we've seen over the last 6 weeks that it's moved not from people, you know, the the odd person working on a Friday or a Monday from home to a lot of people working full time at home, working or wherever may suit, you know, away from it all. And it's interesting how businesses have been responding to it. I was talking to one CEO, and he actually said to me, do you know what? I'm finding that people are being far more productive, surprisingly enough. And he said they're sort of focused, they're managing their days, they're working remotely. And I was curious to know, well, you know, why are they more productive than they would be, say, in an office environment? And he said, well, he said there's a couple of things really. There's a lot of distractions that go on, but that's not about people having their head down and working. But he said there's an awful lot of people like me wandering around, and a lot of my colleagues asking questions, which send all kinds of hairs running, which gets people doing all kinds of work that probably they don't need to at the lengths they do. Whereas actually the working remotely is that people are very focused, they're organising their days, as you've talked about in the previous video, and therefore there's that clarity, providing they've got the challenge, you know, providing they've got the space, providing they've got the right environment, providing they're not having to do the childcare, which is clearly an educating a challenge for many. I've also heard tell of an organisation that very early on sent a message around that home working was not possible, it is unproductive, and therefore everybody needs to be in the office. I hasten to add that organisation has since rescinded that view.
And I suspect they've also saved themselves a fortune in travel costs as well, Mike.
So what you know, what's the working remotely, what's your take on all that, Derek?
It comes back to that stuff, Mike, around about purpose. And, you know, in the first video we talked about people being left in doubt. And there was a number of folk that worked in support roles, and they were in doubt of what it was that they would be able to do in the future. So when we were talking to some of these senior people in organisations, they put it quite simply. They said, we just repurposed them. So they talked about, you know, if there was someone in a support role, perhaps it was for stores, merchandising or something. You know, those stores weren't interested in re-merchandising, they were just interested in trading the place as much as they possibly could to try and catch up in some of their numbers. So how could the merchandising teams be repurposed to assist them? And what they looked at then was, and these people still had to remain their distance as well, so it was perfect for them to work remotely. And what they looked at then was, when they found ways of making it easier for the customers to access certain points within the units, instead of them going into other units and talking to them, as you referenced earlier on, they took loads of photographs, used lots of visual aids, and they then started having virtual conversations with other units to show them how they could make it easier for the customer to shop that environment. There was other support teams in there as well that were perhaps involved in projects, and instead of them, you know, sitting idle, or instead of them working less intensely, they could step up and start assisting the organisation in the distance shopping. So they could source product, they could have that product delivered, they could organise teams that were going to install that product, all done, you know, through distancing, so that it made it very easy for the units to trade. And those folk that were in the project teams suddenly found themselves ramping up what it was that they were doing instead of them working less intensely. So it was a huge contribution on their part as well. The other organisations talked about how they could use some of these remote workers to liaise with customers. So some customers might have placed orders online and hadn't heard anything. So they could use some of these remote workers and get them to start liaising with customers to talk to them about what the situation was with their order, doing all this remotely obviously, and to talk to the customers about what the next actions would be, and indeed in some ways assisting those that were working with the orders to liaise with them about what the customers were saying. So they formed bridges, something that was never done before, but it was getting people to work in different ways, and also putting out that whole idea of the brand of the organisation was such that it was interacting more with the customers in a different way, as opposed to interacting face to face with customers. They were interacting virtually with the customers, and the response from the customers on many occasions was, you know, very considered, very supportive of what it was that the organisation was trying to do. One organisation that we talked to looked at the suppliers as well, and realising that some of the suppliers were kept in doubt, they brought people in who had been working less intensely but remotely, and they'd step them up to liaise with the suppliers, to reassure the suppliers that things were going to be okay, and to talk to suppliers about how the contract was going to work going forward, which the suppliers loved. The feedback from the suppliers was it was important to have that interaction with them. So instead of just doing things that they did in the past, the organisations were quickly rethinking how they interacted with customers, with staff, with suppliers, so that the whole thing kind of worked more harmoniously and everyone was involved in it. And it was the stuff that we referenced in the first video, Mike. It wasn't just about putting a strategy out there and saying this is what we're going to do. It was about bringing everyone into that melting pot and figuring out a way that worked for everyone.
I mean, that the whole thing here is going to be, for all of us, the remoteness, the distancing is going to be radically different. You're going to see, and all you can hear the debates that are going on with airlines about how they're going to do it, restaurants, how they're going to do it. You're seeing it already for sport and whatever. How's it really going to pan out? But it is going to become a way of life, that whole thing about how they do it remotely. I feel like we can't really end the video unless we've addressed really some of the practices, sort of good practice around you know, the virtual interactions, and lots of people have shared with us their experience of it, and I'm going to apologize if you feel Zoom fatigued already, which some people are starting to feel, but we just thought we'd say the sort of, from what we've picked up, there's sort of probably three things to bear in mind, really. The first thing is being clear about what the purpose of the call is, and not being overly ambitious. So is it to share information? Is it to generate ideas? Or is it to make a decision? And do think about the group size if you're trying to make a decision. The second point that people have said to us is really about, for group interactions, do go round the room, get everybody to talk initially, and ask them how they're doing. The important thing that was said to me was not what they're doing, but how they're doing, just to get them to talk about. You'll learn a lot, they've said, about where they're at, their mindset, by just asking them that. And also asking them what decisions they need help with, because that will also give you a chance to unlock where their mind is, what their concerns are, and what's on their mind. The whole thing about going around the room sounds very regimented, but actually what people have found is by doing that, it tends to not just be the dominant normal players who speak and take the airways. It means everybody knows they have to share, and the quieter members can't hide, in the sense of allowing others to take the lead. They know they've got to talk and share where they're at and how they're doing. And the other thing linked to that, and the one thing that we've talked about quite a bit, is it's cameras on. We've had so many in the past, we've done virtual camera and people, I can't quite get the connectivity, or can't do that. And you can hear they've gone on mute and you never quite know. Cameras on, not because you don't trust them. Cameras on because what they say to you might not necessarily tie up with how they're looking at you. And I think there's something about that congruence of the body language. This is the new ways of working. We are going to be doing stuff more virtually, and therefore it's going to be more important to be able to see and hear. And the final thing, the final point, which goes without saying, and it's timely as we come to the end, is thinking about the length and frequency. Not making them too long, having breaks. If you have to do a longer process, it's about breaks. It's also about not trying to do everything through one virtual call, but cascading, getting the, as Derek had spoke about in the previous video, getting the chatter channels going. It's about a number of those things. So hopefully that's given you a good feel from the insights that we've picked up from leaders across a number of fields in how they're leading their teams through the coronavirus crisis. Hope that's been helpful, and that's thanks for watching and listening to myself and Derek. Cheers.
And one last thing, folks, if you want to see the previous video, don't forget there's a link below. You can click on that and that will take you to the previous video. Cheers.